The morning sun had barely peeped through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport when Dr. Michael and Dr. Catherine Chen walked through the bustling terminal, rolling their carry-on luggage behind them. Both were dressed professionally, he in a navy suit that had seen countless medical conferences, and she in a crisp white blazer and black pants. After 20 years of marriage and parallel careers as cardiothoracic surgeons, they had perfected the art of efficient travel. Today's flight to San Francisco felt particularly important. They were heading to present their revolutionary research on minimally invasive heart surgery techniques that could cut recovery time in half for pediatric patients. The research had consumed their lives for the past 3 years, and the medical conference would be their chance to share their findings with the world's top surgeons. As they made their way to the first-class check-in counter, Catherine noticed how the morning light caught her husband's graying temples. She smiled, remembering how they'd first met as residents, both too busy saving lives to realize they were falling in love. Now, after thousands of successful surgeries and countless lives saved together, they were still breaking new ground in their field. The check-in process went smoothly, and they proceeded through security with practiced ease. Michael checked his watch. They were right on schedule, as usual. Their reputation for precision timing in the operating room carried over into every aspect of their lives. As they walked toward their gate, they passed a small coffee shop where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee beckoned. "We have time for a quick cup," Catherine suggested, knowing they both appreciated their morning ritual. Michael nodded, and soon they were sharing a quiet moment together, discussing their presentation while watching other travelers rush past. A young medical student, recognizing them from their published papers, nervously approached to express her admiration for their work. They warmly encouraged her ambitions, remembering their own early days in medicine. Boarding time approached, and they made their way to Gate C-42. The gate area was packed with travelers. Business people tapping away on laptops, families trying to keep children entertained, and other professionals heading west for various reasons. The Chens stood quietly, reviewing their presentation notes on their tablets while waiting for their boarding group to be called. First-class passengers were called to board first, and they gathered their belongings, joining the short line. As they handed their boarding passes to the gate agent, they received the same warm smile they typically did. Their gentle demeanor and professional appearance usually put people at ease. They walked down the jet bridge, discussing the week ahead and the colleagues they looked forward to seeing at the conference. The inside of the aircraft was cool and quiet, that familiar new plane smell still lingering in the air. They found their assigned seats in row 2, A and B, quickly storing their carry-ons in the overhead compartment. Catherine pulled out the medical journal she'd been meaning to finish, while Michael adjusted his seat and checked his phone one last time before airplane mode would be required. Other passengers filed past them, the usual parade of business travelers and vacationers making their way to their seats. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, helping passengers stow bags and get settled. Everything seemed routine, just another flight in the countless ones they'd taken over their careers. Little did they know that in the next few minutes, this ordinary Monday morning flight would become anything but routine. As the last passengers were boarding, there was no indication that they were about to face a situation that would not only test their patience, but would also spark a national conversation of prejudice and professionalism in the most unexpected of places. The Chens sat comfortably in their seats, Catherine absorbed in her journal, and Michael responding to a last-minute email from their research team back in Atlanta. They were completely unaware that they were about to become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, and that their response to what was coming would demonstrate not just their professional achievements, but their personal dignity in the face of prejudice. The first hint of trouble came when a flight attendant with a pinched expression approached the Chen's seats. She wasn't wearing the same welcoming smile as her colleagues, and her body language suggested something was amiss. Dr. Michael Chen looked up from his email, while Dr. Catherine gently placed her medical journal in her lap, both giving the attendant their full attention. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be a seating mistake," the flight attendant said, her voice carrying a tone that suggested this wasn't a simple mix-up. "Would you mind moving to economy class? We have some seats available there." She gestured toward the back of the plane, where passengers were still settling into their seats. Catherine and Michael exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication they'd perfected over years of working together in operating rooms. They'd encountered similar situations before, though never quite so blatant. Michael reached for their boarding passes, which were still in his jacket pocket. "I don't believe there's been any mistake," he said calmly, his voice carrying the same steady tone he used when teaching medical students. "We booked these seats months ago." He handed over their boarding passes, which clearly showed their first-class seat assignments. The flight attendant barely glanced at the documents. Instead, her eyes darted to a well-dressed passenger standing in the aisle, a man in an expensive suit who was watching the interaction with poorly concealed impatience. It became clear that he was somehow connected to this sudden seating mistake. Other passengers nearby began to take notice of the exchange. A woman across the aisle lowered her book, her eyes narrowing as she observed the situation unfolding. A businessman 2 rows ahead turned around, not even pretending to mind his own business anymore. "The thing is," the flight attendant continued, lowering her voice but maintaining her insistence, "we have a valued frequent flyer who specifically requested this row, and we try to accommodate our regular customers whenever possible." Catherine straightened in her seat, her professional demeanor intact, but her eyes showing a flash of the same determination she displayed in the operating room when facing a particularly challenging surgery. "We're also frequent flyers," she said, her voice clear and measured. "More importantly, we're paying customers with assigned seats, just like everyone else on this plane." The tension in the cabin was becoming palpable. A young couple a few rows back started whispering to each other, their faces showing concern. An elderly gentleman across the aisle shook his head disapprovingly at the flight attendant's behavior. Michael pulled out his phone, not to record the interaction, but to pull up their airline status profiles. "We've been Platinum members for the past decade," he said, his tone remaining professional but firm. "We'd book these seats because we often review medical files during flights, which requires the space and privacy that first class provides." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, seeming to realize she had stepped into a situation more complicated than she'd anticipated. The man in the aisle, who had apparently prompted this confrontation, began to look uncomfortable as other passengers' disapproving glances turned toward him. A younger flight attendant, who had been watching from the galley, approached her colleague, whispering something in her ear. The first attendant's expression changed slightly, a mix of embarrassment and uncertainty crossing her face. But instead of backing down, she squared her shoulders and said, "Let me get my supervisor to sort this out." As she walked away, the cabin had grown unusually quiet. The normal pre-flight chatter had died down as more passengers became aware of the situation. The Chens sat calmly in their seats, their posture relaxed but resolute. They'd faced subtle discrimination before, but this time felt different. This time, they had an audience, and their response would matter not just for them, but for others who might face similar situations in the future. What happened next would show everyone on that plane that dignity and professionalism could be powerful weapons against prejudice, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with loud protests, but with quiet strength and unwavering resolve. The minutes that followed felt like hours in the tense cabin air. Dr. Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a leather folder containing not just their boarding passes, but also their medical credentials and hospital IDs. Years of experience had taught them to always be prepared for moments like these. "I think it's time we cleared up any confusion," she said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she used when explaining complex procedures to nervous parents before their children's surgeries. She opened the folder on her lap, revealing numerous awards and recognition letters alongside their credentials. The supervisor appeared quickly, a tall woman with graying hair who had clearly been briefed about the situation. She approached with what seemed to be a rehearsed speech, but stopped short when she saw the documents spread across Catherine's lap. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the credentials. "We're on our way to present groundbreaking pediatric surgery research at the National Medical Conference," Michael explained calmly, his voice steady and clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "These seats weren't randomly chosen. We need the space to review our presentation materials." A young woman sitting across the aisle gasped softly. "Oh my goodness," she said, turning to her seatmate. "I just realized. They're the ones who developed that new heart valve procedure for children. I read about their work in Medical Weekly." The supervisor's demeanor shifted noticeably as murmurs spread through the cabin. The man who had wanted their seats began to look increasingly uncomfortable, tugging at his collar and avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. "My daughter was born with a heart defect," a voice called out from a few rows back. A mother stood up, her eyes glistening with tears. "Doctors like you are the reason she's alive today. I can't believe anyone would ask you to move." The Chens maintained their professional composure, though the woman's words touched them deeply. This was why they had dedicated their lives to medicine, not for recognition, but for the lives they could save and improve. The supervisor, now visibly flustered, began apologizing profusely. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," she stammered. "Of course you'll stay in your assigned seats. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience." But Catherine raised her hand gently, stopping the supervisor mid-sentence. "This isn't about our credentials," she said firmly but kindly. "This is about treating all passengers with respect, regardless of their profession or appearance." Michael nodded in agreement. "We're fortunate that our achievements speak for us," he added. "But what about others who might face similar treatment without having credentials to defend themselves?" The cabin had grown completely silent. Even the children who had been playing noisily earlier were quiet, sensing the importance of the moment. The flight attendant who had initially approached them stood near the galley, her face flushed with embarrassment. A round of spontaneous applause broke out among the passengers. The Chens didn't acknowledge it, instead returning to their medical journals with the same quiet dignity they had shown throughout the confrontation. The supervisor quickly arranged for the complaining passenger to be seated elsewhere, and the original flight attendant was replaced for the duration of the flight. As the final preparations for takeoff began, there was a different energy in the cabin, one of reflection and respect. Other passengers began sharing their own stories in hushed voices, times they had witnessed or experienced discrimination, times they had stayed silent when they should have spoken up. What started as an ugly incident had transformed into a powerful moment of community and understanding. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, the Chens resumed reviewing their presentation materials, appearing unruffled by the entire incident. But their calm handling of the situation had taught everyone on board a lesson more valuable than any medical procedure. One about dignity, professionalism, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The situation was far from over, despite the supervisor's apologies. As the plane sat at the gate, more airline staff began to gather near the front of the cabin. The head flight attendant appeared, followed by the gate agent clutching a tablet and looking concerned. They huddled together, speaking in hushed tones while glancing frequently at the Chens. Dr. Catherine continued reviewing her medical papers, but Dr. Michael noticed how other passengers were now openly using their phones to document the growing scene. A young man in a business suit 2 rows back was typing rapidly on his phone, likely sharing the story on social media. Another passenger was quietly narrating the events into her phone's voice recorder. The head flight attendant finally approached their seats, her face a mixture of authority and uncertainty. "I understand there's been some confusion about the seating arrangements," she began, her voice carrying a practiced customer service tone. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss privately," Michael replied, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the cabin. "We're sitting in our assigned seats, which we paid for, and we intend to stay in them." A ripple of supportive murmurs spread through the cabin. An elderly gentleman across the aisle spoke up. I've been flying this airline for 30 years, and I've never seen such poor treatment of passengers. The gate agent stepped forward, tablet in hand. According to our records, she started, but Catherine gently interrupted her. According to your records, we booked these seats 3 months ago, she said, pulling up the confirmation email on her phone. We specifically chose them because we need to review sensitive medical documents during the flight. Documents that could help save children's lives. The impact of her words was visible on the faces of everyone within earshot. A flight attendant at the back of first class paused while helping another passenger, her expression softening as she listened. Can you imagine? A woman whispered loudly to her seatmate, asking doctors to move from seats they booked just because someone else wanted them. And right before they're heading to present life-saving research. The pressure in the cabin was building. More phones were out now, recording every word and gesture. The airline staff seemed increasingly aware that this situation was spiraling beyond their control. Our flight is already running 20 minutes late. Someone called out from the economy section. Just let them keep their seats so we can take off. The head flight attendant looked desperately at her tablet, probably hoping to find some policy or procedure to handle this situation. But there was none. This wasn't about policies or procedures anymore. It was about basic human dignity and respect. Catherine turned to the gathered airline staff, her expression kind but firm. We've spent our entire careers in high-pressure situations, she said. We make life and death decisions every day. Right now, you have a simple decision to make. Will you do what's right, or will you continue to make this situation worse? The cabin fell silent, waiting for the staff's response. Even the usual airplane background noise, the hum of the ventilation system, the beeping of service phones, seemed muted. Through the windows, the morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Other planes taxied past, their passengers unaware of the drama unfolding in this cabin. A flight attendant's phone buzzed, probably news from airline management, as word of the situation had surely reached them by now. The head flight attendant straightened her uniform jacket, clearly preparing to make an announcement. The gate agent clutched her tablet tighter, while other crew members watched nervously. The next few moments would determine not just how this flight would proceed, but how this story would be told in the hours and days to come. The tension in the cabin was electric, every passenger waiting to see what would happen next. Some had already missed their connections, but nobody complained. They all seemed to understand they were witnesses to something important, a moment when common decency and justice hung in the balance. Just as the head flight attendant opened her mouth to speak, a commotion arose from the middle of the plane. A young woman in scrubs stood up, her hand shaking slightly as she raised her phone. She was clearly nervous about speaking up, but determination showed in her eyes. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she called out, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger. "But I need everyone to know something. Dr. Catherine Chen performed my little sister's heart surgery 2 years ago." She held up her phone, displaying a medical journal article with Catherine's photo. That surgery was supposed to be impossible. 3 other hospitals had turned us away. The revelation sent a wave of whispers through the cabin. The airline staff froze, their expressions shifting from professional detachment to dawning recognition. The head flight attendant's face paled as she glanced down at her tablet, probably seeing the Chen's full credentials for the first time. "The surgery they're going to present at the conference," the young woman continued, wiping tears from her eyes. "It's about the technique they developed while saving my sister. They're not just doctors, they're pioneers. They give hope to families who have none left." Catherine and Michael remained composed, though their eyes softened at the young woman's words. They had performed hundreds of surgeries over their careers, touching countless lives, never expecting recognition or special treatment. Another passenger, a middle-aged man in a cardigan, stood up. "I'm a high school science teacher," he said. "I've been using articles about their research to inspire my students. Do you know how many young people, especially minorities, have decided to pursue medicine because of their work. The original complaining passenger had shrunk into a corner of the cabin, his earlier demands for their seats forgotten. Some nearby passengers were giving him disapproving looks, while others simply shook their heads. A flight attendant who had been quiet throughout the ordeal stepped forward. "My cousin's child is scheduled for heart surgery next month," she said softly. "I've been reading about your minimally invasive techniques, hoping his doctors might use them." Her eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd meet you like this." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What began as a confrontation had become something like a testimonial. Passengers shared looks of amazement and respect, many still recording the scene on their phones. The head flight attendant's phone buzzed again, this time with an urgent message from airline management. Her face showed both relief and embarrassment as she read it. The gate agent leaned over her shoulder, nodding quickly. "Dr. and Dr. Chen," the head flight attendant announced, her voice now carrying a note of genuine respect. "On behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies. Not only will you keep your assigned seats, but we'd like to offer you lifetime premium status with our airline." Catherine raised her hand gently, stopping the offer mid-sentence. "We don't want special treatment," she said firmly. "What we want is for every passenger to be treated with the same respect we're receiving right now. Special status shouldn't be required for basic dignity." Her words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity and truth. Several passengers nodded in agreement. A few were typing her words into their phones, sharing this moment of wisdom with the world beyond the plane. The entire cabin crew was being replaced, new staff filing in with apologetic smiles. The original flight attendant who had started the confrontation was quickly escorted off the plane, along with the supervisor who had initially dismissed their concerns. As the situation finally began to settle, a small girl, no more than 7 years old, walked up to their seats clutching a paper airplane she had been playing with. "When I grow up," she announced proudly, "I want to be just like you. Not because you're doctors, but because you're brave." The mood on the plane shifted dramatically as news of the Chen's identity spread through social media. Flight attendants who had just boarded were already aware of the situation, having seen it trending on their phones. The airline's public relations team was in full crisis mode, desperately trying to get ahead of a story that was growing bigger by the minute. A gentle ping sounded through the cabin as the aircraft's Wi-Fi system came alive. Passengers who had been sharing the story online suddenly noticed their posts were going viral. One video had already reached over 50,000 views, and comments were pouring in from around the world. "Look at this," a teenager whispered to his mother, showing her his phone. People are sharing stories about how Dr. Catherine saved their children. The mother leaned over, reading the flood of comments with tears in her eyes. Each message told a different story of hope, healing, and lives changed forever. The new head flight attendant approached the Chens with a satellite phone in hand. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but our CEO would like to speak with you personally." Her manner was completely different from the previous crew, respectful, professional, and genuinely apologetic. Michael politely declined the call. "We appreciate the gesture," he said kindly, "but right now, we need to focus on our presentation for tomorrow." He pulled out a tablet containing complex surgical diagrams, emphasizing their priorities. Catherine added softly, "This isn't about us or your airline. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." Her words carried through the cabin, and several passengers nodded in agreement. One man in a business suit was already drafting an email to cancel his corporate account with the airline. The airline's regional manager had arrived at the gate, slightly out of breath from running through the terminal. She spoke urgently with the flight crew, then made her way down the aisle. But before she could reach the Chens, something unexpected happened. Other passengers began standing up, one by one, creating a protective barrier around the doctor's seats. It wasn't planned or coordinated, just a spontaneous show of support from people who had witnessed enough. They need to prepare for their conference, One woman announced firmly to the manager. They've been delayed long enough. Others murmured in agreement, and the manager retreated, understanding that this situation required a different approach. Outside the plane's windows, the morning had fully bloomed into a bright day. Ground crew members were pointing at the aircraft, having heard about the incident through their radios. Some were taking photos, aware they were witnessing something significant. The new flight crew worked efficiently to prepare for takeoff, treating every passenger with extra care and attention. The complaining passenger had been quietly relocated to a different flight, and a sense of calm finally settled over the cabin. A young medical student, sitting a few rows back, raised her hand shyly. When a flight attendant approached, she asked if she could give something to the Chens. After getting approval, she walked forward and placed a handwritten note on their tray table. "Dear doctors," she had written, "today you taught us something more valuable than medicine. You showed us how to stand up for what's right with grace and dignity. Thank you for paving the way for future generations." The note was passed around the cabin, and other passengers began adding their own messages of support and gratitude. What had started as an ugly incident of discrimination had transformed into a powerful moment of unity and understanding. As the plane finally began to push back from the gate, nearly an hour behind schedule, not a single passenger complained about the delay. They knew they had witnessed something more important than an on-time arrival. They had seen how quiet strength and unwavering dignity could change hearts and minds. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the airline's damage control efforts kicked into high gear. The regional manager had already sent an urgent message to the corporate office, and now the CEO himself was drafting a public statement. But nothing they could say would undo what had happened. In the first-class cabin, things had settled into an unusual calm. The new crew was professional and attentive, though clearly nervous about making any mistakes. They moved through their service routines with extra care, treating every passenger with notably increased respect. A flight attendant approached the Chens with a tablet in hand. "The airline would like to offer you full refunds for your tickets, plus unlimited free flights for the next year," she said quietly, trying to keep the conversation private. Catherine looked up from her medical papers and shared a knowing look with her husband. "Please tell your management that we don't want compensation," she replied. "What we want is meaningful change. Use that money for staff training instead." The crew member's eyes widened at this response. She'd clearly been expecting a different reaction. In her 15 years of airline service, she'd never encountered passengers who turned down free flights. Meanwhile, news of the incident had spread beyond the plane. The Chen's phones were buzzing constantly with messages from colleagues, former patients, and media outlets. One message caught Michael's attention. It was from the hospital where they worked. "The board of directors is officially backing you," the message read. "They're releasing a statement supporting your stand against discrimination in all forms. Your courage is inspiring change beyond the airline industry." A gray-haired woman across the aisle leaned over. "My granddaughter wants to be a doctor," she said softly. "But she's worried about facing discrimination. Would you mind if I took a photo of you both to show her that success is possible despite the challenges?" The Chens agreed, and soon the grandmother was telling them about her granddaughter's dreams of becoming a heart surgeon. Other passengers listened intently, many recording this quiet conversation that held so much meaning. The flight attendants had begun their regular service, but there was nothing regular about the atmosphere in the cabin. Passengers who would normally have been sleeping or working were engaged in deep conversations about prejudice, courage, and change. In economy class, a group of teachers were already planning how to use this story in their classrooms. "This is a real-life lesson in standing up for what's right," one said, taking careful notes on her phone. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, providing flight updates. But then he added something unusual. "We have two very special passengers with us today who remind us that true first-class status isn't about where you sit, but how you conduct yourself when faced with injustice." The cabin broke into spontaneous applause, not just for the Chens, but for the principle they represented. People who had boarded the plane as strangers now felt united in their witness of this powerful moment. Catherine turned to a young boy who had been watching everything with wide eyes. "Remember," she said gently, "sometimes the most important operations we perform aren't in the operating room. They're in everyday moments when we choose to stand up for what's right." As the plane continued its journey westward, the story was spreading across social media platforms. Hashtags were trending, and people worldwide were sharing their own experiences of facing discrimination with dignity. What had started as a simple flight was becoming a movement. The Chens returned to their medical papers, preparing for tomorrow's presentation. But they knew that today, they had already taught something just as valuable as their surgical techniques. They had shown that dignity, grace, and unwavering principle could be the most powerful instruments of change. The news of what happened on the flight spread faster than anyone expected. By the time they were halfway to San Francisco, the incident had become the top trending topic on every social media platform. But the real impact was happening in ways that couldn't be measured by likes or shares. In the plane's cabin, a quiet revolution was taking place. A group of business travelers in the middle section had started sharing their own experiences with discrimination. One woman spoke about being the only female executive in her company, while another passenger talked about the challenges he faced as an older worker in the tech industry. The new flight attendants had also been touched by the events. During their break, they gathered in the galley area, speaking in hushed tones about starting a support group for airline staff who had witnessed or experienced discrimination. "We need to be part of the solution," one of them whispered, "not part of the problem." Dr. Catherine was reviewing her presentation when a note was passed to her from economy class. It was written on a simple air sickness bag, but the message was powerful. "My daughter is in medical school. She faces discrimination every day. Today, you showed her how to handle it with grace. Thank you." Meanwhile, Dr. Michael noticed something remarkable happening on his phone. The medical conference organizers had heard about the incident and decided to adjust their schedule. They wanted the Chens to give an additional talk, not about surgery this time, but about breaking barriers in medicine. A flight attendant approached with another update from the airline's corporate office. They had announced an immediate review of their training policies and were establishing a new customer respect initiative. The CEO had scheduled an emergency meeting with civil rights leaders for the following morning. The young medical student who had recognized them earlier was now helping to document everything. "This isn't just about one flight anymore," she explained to nearby passengers. "This is about changing how people treat each other everywhere." In the cockpit, the pilots had received messages from other flight crews around the country. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff were all sharing the story, promising to do better, to speak up when they saw wrongdoing, to make sure every passenger was treated with dignity. A teacher in economy class had pulled out her laptop and was already creating a lesson plan. "This is the kind of real-world example our students need," she explained to her seatmate. "It shows them that standing up for yourself doesn't mean losing your composure." The Chens continued their work, occasionally glancing at each other with small smiles. They had faced discrimination before, but this time was different. This time, their stand had sparked something bigger than themselves. Near the back of the plane, a group of teenagers had started a social media campaign. #DignitInFlight was trending, with people sharing stories of how they'd stood up to discrimination or promised to do better in the future. The hashtag was becoming a movement for change. An older flight attendant stopped by the Chens' seats with tears in her eyes. "I've been flying for 30 years, she said softly. "I've seen so many instances of unfair treatment, but I always felt powerless to stop it. Today, you showed us all that we have the power to make things right." As the plane began its gradual descent towards San Francisco, passengers were exchanging contact information, promising to stay in touch, to share updates, to continue the conversation that had started at 30,000 feet. What had begun as an ugly incident had transformed into a powerful moment of community and change. The airline's corporate communications team was working overtime, but they were missing the real story. This wasn't about damage control or public relations anymore. It was about how two quiet, dignified professionals had shown everyone on board that sometimes the strongest response to discrimination isn't anger or outrage, but unwavering self-respect and grace. 6 months after that memorable flight, the impact of what happened continued to ripple through society in unexpected ways. The story had become more than just a viral moment. It had sparked real, lasting change. The airline had completely transformed its training program. Every new employee now went through an intensive respect and dignity workshop. Videos of the incident were used in training sessions, not to shame anyone, but to teach the importance of treating every passenger with equal respect. Dr. Catherine and Dr. Michael had returned to their regular lives, performing surgeries and saving lives. But something was different now. Their waiting room had become a place of hope for young medical students, especially those from minority backgrounds. These students would often sit quietly, just watching how the doctors worked, learning not just about medicine, but about carrying oneself with dignity. The young medical student from the flight had started a mentorship program at her university. She called it Dignity in Medicine, and it helped support students facing discrimination in their medical careers. The program had quickly spread to other medical schools across the country. The flight crew members who witnessed everything that day had formed a support network. They shared stories, offered advice, and helped each other stand up against discrimination when they saw it. Their small group had grown into a nationwide movement within the airline industry. One morning, as the Chens prepared for surgery, they received a special letter. It was from a 12-year-old girl who had been on their flight. She wrote about how watching them that day had changed her life. "I used to think that fighting back meant getting angry," she wrote. "You showed me that the strongest people are often the quietest ones." The airline had made permanent changes to its policies. Every employee manual now included a section called the Chen Protocol, guidelines for handling discrimination with professionalism and respect. Other airlines began adopting similar policies, not wanting to repeat the mistakes that had led to that day's events. The business world had taken notice too. Companies started inviting the Chens to speak about leadership and dignity in the workplace. They always told the same story, not about being victims of discrimination, but about the power of staying true to your principles. The grandmother who had taken their picture to show her granddaughter sent an update. Her granddaughter had been accepted to medical school. In her application essay, she wrote about watching that flight video and learning that success doesn't mean having to choose between dignity and determination. Back at their hospital, the Chens had started a new tradition. Every Friday, they held informal meetings with young doctors and medical students. They didn't talk about surgical techniques or medical procedures. Instead, they shared stories about navigating challenges with grace, about standing firm without losing composure, about changing minds through actions rather than words. The incident had even reached school classrooms. Teachers used the story to discuss civil rights, professional behavior, and the power of quiet strength. Students learned that sometimes the most powerful response to unfairness is calm confidence in your own worth. As time passed, fewer people remembered the exact details of what happened on that flight, but the lessons remained. Other passengers who had witnessed it spoke about how it changed their own behavior, making them more likely to speak up when they saw injustice. The final change came quietly, almost unnoticed. The airline industry's customer satisfaction surveys started including a new question. Were you treated with dignity and respect throughout your journey? It was a small addition, but it represented a fundamental shift in how airlines viewed their responsibility to passengers. The Chens never sought recognition for what they did that day. They continued their work, saving lives in the operating room and changing lives through their example. Their story had shown that sometimes the most powerful way to fight discrimination isn't through confrontation, but through unwavering dignity and quiet strength.